Do you want to know when I realized I was not young anymore? I don't know when this happened. I think it happened at least 15 or more years ago. I was walking along and then I saw a really young person wearing a Kurt Cobain t-shirt and I'm like, "Oh, you like Nirvana?" And she said, "I love classic rock." And I'm like, "Oh my God, Nirvana is classic rock?" But Nirvana is kind of classic rock, not just because of the hideous, cruel nature of time, but also because Kurt Cobain was an iconic figure, and the way that he met his end, unfortunately, also was iconic. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I watched recently a documentary called Soaked in Bleach, and it deals with the conspiracy theory that Courtney Love, Kurt Cobain's wife, was behind his murder. And they have two main pieces of evidence. A little bit, they're not really evidence, but they have two main ways to support this theory. One is the forensic evidence, and the other one is the testimony of a PI. And this PI, basically, they interview him for the most of the movie, and then he says what other people told him 20 years ago, and then those situations are reenacted. And his theory is that Love killed Cobain because she was afraid of the fact that he was going to divorce her and leave her with nothing. But that misunderstands who Courtney Love was in the 1990s. So, Courtney Love was also a rock star in the early 1990s. And she was accused at the time of kind of riding Kurt's coattails to become famous. She had a band called Hole, and they had a hit called Someday You Will Ache Like I Ache. And I think that happened, that was released right after uh, Nirvana split up because of Kurt's death. She was also later in a movie called The People versus Larry Flint. So in the 90s, maybe she wasn't like an A-list celebrity or even a B-list celebrity, but she was like a C-list celebrity. And in the 90s, a C-list celebrity could get by, right? They had enough money. So what I'm saying is she didn't need to kill Kurt for his money, right? And so leaving that theory aside, and I'm not gonna try and defend Courtney Love because I don't know her very well or at all, and it's not really my place to defend her. But it does seem like she had a really difficult time in her life because of who she was and when they were famous, because being famous in 1994 is completely different than being famous in 2026. In 2026, you might be famous and only like a percentage of a percentage of a percentage of people know who you are. But in 1994, I would say like 95% of everyone under the age of 25 or 30 knew who Courtney Love was. So that's a different level of fame. And as I said, she was like a C-list celebrity. So this detective, he interviews a bunch of like Kurt's friends and business associates, and his friends, and they're also interviewed in this movie. They say, "Oh, he would never commit suicide. He wasn't suicidal." So these friends that they talk to, they're not talking to people who were around Kurt before he died. They're talking to high school friends. And, things change, situations change, and you're not always in the same frame of mind as you were in high school. and they said something interesting like, yeah, he was a quiet guy and he never really talked about his emotions. So how do you know he wasn't suicidal then if he never talked about his emotions and you last spoke when you were in high school? So that thing doesn't make a lot of sense. Um, and they also do this thing where they have interviews with Kurt, which will immediately kind of like underline their point. And there's two particular ones that I want to focus on. The first one is that they kind of quote an interview where he says that his stomach problems aren't bothering him anymore because the theory is that he was in pain all the time and that's why he turned to heroin and that's ultimately why he killed himself because he couldn't stand the pain anymore. And not like the emotional pain like Jim Morrison, but like the physical pain of his stomach. So he gets interviewed and they ask him about his stomach and he's like, yeah, it's fine now. Well, one, it might have been fine at that moment, but maybe it wasn't fine later. And, like if you have some kind of treatment that does something wonderful for you, and then you lose that treatment, it loses its efficacy, then you're going to be like super depressed. So that's one thing that may have happened. And, his stomach may have been fine, but he may have had a lot of other emotional problems, right? That's possible. Another thing that I find really, really weird is they quote him as saying, like, because somebody brings up the fact that a lot of his songs have suicidal themes in them, which they do. And he's like, oh, no, the lyrics don't mean anything, I just had like I had like 2 minutes to think of a song, and then I just wrote down the lyrics. And they take the movie takes that at face value. But if you don't know anything about Kurt Cobain, he presented this like, oh shucks, authentic. I don't want to be a rock star, but he spent his entire life trying to be a rock star. He thought about the lyrics. He put a lot of effort into writing songs, writing lyrics, and all of that stuff. So if he wrote about suicide, there was a reason he wrote about suicide. Like you can write about suicide from like a third person perspective, and you can be like, yes, I am talking about suicide, but it's not me that I'm talking about. I'm talking about the subject, like I'm doing now. But I don't think that was it. And I don't think that you can trust an artist 100% when they say something like that, because that is just a deflection. Because as I said, they were one of the most famous. They were one of the most famous people in 1994 when he died, and so people were looking at the lyrics, which have a lot of controversy associated with them. Like they have a famous song called "Rape Me," and so he had to defend his lyrics. He had to be like, no, that's not what I mean when I say that. So he was really defensive about his lyrics. So the first three kind of pillars of the conspiracy theory fall apart. Like one, that Courtney Love couldn't survive without Kurt's money. That's not true. Two, that there's no way that Kurt could have been suicidal. He could have been suicidal. They talked to his friends who were his friends in high school. They talk about his stomach problems, which may have returned. And they talk about his art. Like the evidence in the art is not actually evidence. So, okay, let's set that aside for a moment. And let's talk about the other part of this film. It spends a lot of time talking about forensic evidence. And I read really quickly the Wikipedia article before I started recording. And with at least two of the experts they talked to, they did this thing that documentarians often do where they edited their replies to make it look like they supported the thesis of the movie. There's one person who is like a linguistic forensics our forensic linguist, and she is examining the letter to see if it seems like a suicide note. And her conclusion was that it was a suicide note. And she says something like, you would think that these would be the classic signs of the suicide note. And then probably what she said is, yes, and it is. But they cut that part out. And they cut another detective out who agrees with the suicide theory. But generally, their evidence is that the gun was placed in such a hand, like he had the gun, and I'm sorry, this is going to be really graphic, but it's about suicide, so I can't really be not graphic when I'm talking about it. But anyway, he had the gun pointed at his head like this. He shot, and then the bullet went through his brain, and then his hand kind of like froze in this grip, right? Which is evidence that there was, that it was a suicide. But then they say, well, the shell was on the other side because there was like a spent casing on a pillow. So basically the discharge thing was in this direction and the pillow was over here and the spent casing was over there. But imagine you're like, so and I'm sorry that it's so graphic again, but like imagine you're standing up and you shoot yourself and you fall backwards, and as you're falling, like there's simple explanations as to why the shell didn't land on this side but that side, right? And the other argument that they make is that, there was so much heroin in his blood that he couldn't have pulled the trigger. But if that's true, there would be evidence of other people in the room, And one of their arguments is like, it could have been murder because the police on the scene, they ruled that it was suicide. And they're not experts in investigation. But, police need to have a basic understanding of investigation, right? And just because they're not, they're not homicide detectives, they doesn't mean they can't look at a scene and say, okay, something's weird here, something's off. There are like too many footprints here. This might be a homicide. We need to like call somebody, right? And I think that the reason why people don't want it to be a suicide is because they want to kind of preserve Kurt's virtue, which is a really weird thing. They want to say, well, he was such a nice guy. He would never abandon his child. I mean, he did, And I know that you want to make his life less sad than it was. But, the guy at least got to live out his dream for a little bit. Maybe the dream tarnished and maybe he realized that it wasn't actually as good as he thought it would be. But not everybody can get that moment in their lives. And I think there are a lot of people who, like this detective, who kind of like use it to establish their career and kind of like benefit from it. And I think that's pretty sick. And I don't know. Like, I think if Courtney Love really, this is going to sound really horrible, but I think if Courtney Love really did murder her husband, she probably would have told the world by now. Because I think that's the kind of personality that Courtney Love has, very public kind of person. But I don't know. So very sensitive topic, but I didn't like the documentary. I thought it was too conspiratorial. And I thought that 80% of it was based on hearsay. So, yeah. All right. Thanks. Bye-bye. Oh, if you like what I do, please subscribe and all that jazz. Bye.